So today, the Supreme Court issued a 9-0 unanimous decision which impacts our rights to prevent the warrantless entry into our homes. This is a case that all Americans should actually know about and be aware of, especially gun owners who are potentially worried about unlawful entry into our homes. So let's break down what just happened in this critical case. Now, before we jump into this video, if you guys want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe. Also, you can click on the notification bell and turn on all notifications because that helps to ensure that YouTube will send you these videos when I release them. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing a new Supreme Court 9-0 unanimous decision that was issued just today. This case involves when police can enter someone's home without a warrant. And this is a decision that came in a challenge in a case called Case versus Montana. This is a challenge that's very important for gun owners and really everyone in America because it involves when law enforcement potentially can use some legal workarounds, not only to enter your home, but then potentially enter it without a warrant and then potentially confiscate firearms or, do other things while they're inside your home. In this case, the Supreme Court issued a unanimous decision that was authored by Ketanji Brown Jackson. And in that ruling, essentially, they found that probable cause is not needed to make entry into someone's home in an emergency aid situation. Instead, the analysis that was applied here is really whether an officer has an objectively reasonable basis for believing that their entry is needed to prevent harm to that occupant. In the case, the Supreme Court rejected and overruled the reasonable suspicion standard that was used by the lower court, the Montana Supreme Court, and instead they applied this whole objectively reasonable standard, and they said that that is the test that needs to be used going forward. On review, the Supreme Court found that the police officer had an objectively reasonable basis to enter Mr. Case's home, and therefore the evidence and all of that was found when they entered the home without a warrant should not be suppressed. Now, the facts around this case are very important to understand, the outcome of this ruling. Essentially here, the individual, Trevor Case's ex-girlfriend, called police saying that he had called her and she said that she had a bad feeling, that she heard maybe that he had a firearm and that he said he was potentially going to harm himself and police officers if they arrived at his home. Police responded, they arrived at the home along with the girlfriend, and when they arrived at the home, she told them that she couldn't really remember exactly what he had said, but that she had a bad feeling and that potentially he might shoot himself or the police officers. Now, apparently all of the police officers knew Mr. Case, they knew he had a history of some mental health issues, and they had prior interactions with this individual. When the 4 police officers arrived at the home, they looked through the windows into the rooms. They did not see Mr. Case. One of the police officers noticed that there was potentially an empty handgun and an empty holster and a notepad as well. And the officers knocked on the doors, shined lights and flashlights through the windows, called for Mr. Case, but he did not respond. And after about 40 minutes at the home, the police officers decided to enter the house through the front door, which they found was unlocked. Now, before entering the home, some of the police officers expressed concerns about going into that house based on some of the prior interactions with Mr. Case and also based on some of the statements that the ex-girlfriend told them. But ultimately, after 40 minutes, they decided to enter the home. Now, when they entered the home, 2 of the police officers went upstairs. One of the officers entered an upstairs bedroom, and when he entered the room, he saw that there was a closet. He saw that the closet curtain kind of jerked open, and it revealed that Mr. Case was inside the closet. Now, the officer said he saw something like a black object, and he kind of responded quickly, I believe out of shock, and then shot Mr. Case in the arm, and it passed through into his stomach. Eventually, they detained him, arrested him. They searched the bedroom, and I believe they found a handgun in kind of a close by, laundry basket that was also in that bedroom. Now, in response to this, he was charged and convicted of multiple criminal charges, but he did argue at the case that the officer's warrantless entry into his house violated the 4th Amendment, so the gun and other evidence that was found within the home should be suppressed. Now, those arguments were ultimately rejected by the lower courts and eventually also by the Montana Supreme Court, who issued a 4-3 ruling against him. However, that ruling by the Montana Supreme Court did not use prior Supreme Court precedent in cases like Brigham City. It did not use the standard outlined by the Supreme Court in that case, but instead they appeared to use and kind of apply a lower standard of reasonable suspicion. Because of that, he then appealed and petitioned up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court granted review to this case, recently held oral arguments in this case, and then today they issued their ruling. Now, after listening to the oral arguments, I stated that my impression was that this case would really hinge on the fact that the Montana Supreme Court did not properly apply the U.S. Supreme Court prior decisions and the unanimous rulings in cases like Brigham City versus Stewart. Now, in that case, the Supreme Court said that the analysis in these types of situations should be objectively reasonable, not probable cause or reasonable suspicion. So the standard really was objectively reasonable, and a lot of that was hit on and argued in the Supreme Court. After the arguments, I stated that I thought there were really two routes the Supreme Court would go down in this case. They would either remand the case to the Montana Supreme Court, tell them to apply the correct standard that was outlined in Brigham City, or they would apply Brigham City on their own, weigh that against the facts in Mr. Case's situation, and then rule on the case and try to give guidance to lower courts on how to deal with these type of emergency aid cases. In this unanimous ruling issued by the Supreme Court today, the Supreme Court took that second option. They decided to apply the objectively reasonable standard on their own, weighed against the facts in this case, and ultimately they ruled against Mr. Case. The Supreme Court unanimously held that the police here do not need probable cause to enter a home without a warrant when they are responding to a genuine emergency or this type of situation. Instead, the court reaffirmed the rule that was outlined in Brigham City, that essentially officers may enter a home if they have an objectively reasonable basis to believe that someone inside is seriously injured or facing imminent harm. The Supreme Court here actually rejected Montana's use of the whole watered down community caretaking standard and reasonable suspicion. And also they rejected the argument by Mr. Case that the Fourth Amendment requires probable cause also in these type of emergency aid situations. Probable cause, the court explained, is tied to criminal investigations and does not translate well to these non-criminal life-saving interventions, and therefore they did not want to apply probable cause to this case. Now, applying the whole objectively reasonable standard, the Supreme Court here concluded that the officers' entry into the home and their actions were reasonable here, and therefore they upheld ultimately what the Montana Supreme Court said. So they did not agree with the analysis of the Montana Supreme Court, but they ultimately agreed with the outcome of the decision. The Supreme Court stated that the police officers here were responding to a credible report of a threat, heard, that a gun may be involved or maybe was fired, observed an empty holster, and received no response from inside the home when they got to the location. They stated that taking all these facts together, the officers had an objectively reasonable basis to enter the home without a warrant. The Fourth Amendment, the court emphasized, does not require police to stand by and do nothing in the face of an imminent risk to human life, or even when situations carry danger for the officers themselves. So they said that they don't need to get a warrant, they don't have to adhere to probable cause, but they just need an objectively reasonable basis. So this is kind of that middle road that they decided to go down. They rejected the very loose standard of reasonable suspicion. They rejected the very strong standard of probable cause. Instead, they left it to an objectively reasonable test. The Supreme Court in this ruling stated that we repeat today what we have held before. An officer may enter a home without a warrant if he has an objectively reasonable basis for believing that an occupant is seriously injured or imminently threatened with such injury. The officer's entry therefore satisfies that test. Accordingly, we affirm the judgment, even though not all of the reasoning of the Montana Supreme Court. So in essence, the Supreme Court upheld the ultimate conclusion of the Montana Supreme Court, but rejected the analysis that was used by them to reach that conclusion. Now, this ruling is important because it impacts everyone's protections against these warrant exceptions. The Supreme Court has now once again ruled that in emergency aid situations, the government may enter your home without a warrant if they have objectively reasonable basis to believe that someone, maybe you inside, are seriously injured or facing some sort of imminent harm. No doubt there will be fallout from this ruling, and it will likely impact a lot of these other cases that are currently pending with similar situations. So this is something we're going to have to watch closely going forward to see, what happens now after the Supreme Court ruling and how does it impact other cases. But this again is something that everyone should be aware of because of this new ruling. So that's what happened in this critical case. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help to fuel the algorithm or Al Gore's rhythm. It adds fuel to his jet and just tells YouTube that you appreciate this type of content and it should share it to more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.